Good afternoon. This is the Devar Torah on Parashat Ki Thavo. It is a parsha that is fairly lengthy. It starts with time when after we go into Eretz Israel, and the land has been conquered, and all the tribes have got their share in the land. And he has to bring each person with land has to bring a basket of first offerings, and and then after the Kohen takes it, it then says the person has to make the following declaration, which reads as follows. Anitza Amrata Nifnei Hashem Elokecha Ami Eved Avi Yered Mitzrayim Megashem B'Mitzmat Lehi Sham L'Goy Gadol Atzum Rav. And then it goes on to talk about how the Egyptians were cruel and how Hashem delivered us to the land of what would be called in English milk and honey. And Chalav and Davash and Zavad. Rolling with milk and honey. And it then goes on to talk about bringing of the different tithes to the poor people. And Moshe is announcing that he's completing it, and then the mitzvahs of the Torah. Moshe then says, remember, this is in the last 30 days of his life. He gives the following instructions to the people, telling them what they have to do. And after they cross into Eretz Israel, Moshe will no longer be there. They have to make a large stones, blast them with lime, and write the entire Torah out. And afterwards, when they get into Eretz Israel, 6 tribes are going to stand for the people's blessing among Gerizim, and 6 were Antibal. And it then announces the curses if people don't keep certain commandments. The blessings, Mendenta says, it goes into the blessings that we'll have, and the rest of the parsha, most of the balance of the parsha, is going into all the things that will happen, that will befall us when we don't keep Hashem's Torah, and that eventually we will ultimately be redeemed. And what I'd like to emphasize and discuss is the first few verses of the parsha, and particularly, and it sounds this should be familiar to what I'm going to be discussing, because it's also quoted in the Pesach Haggadah. It says, my ancestor was a homeless Aramean. He went to Egypt. Excuse me. It talks about how he went down, how he was oppressed, was a homeless Aramean, and is explaining, which is referring to he was persecuted, meaning an Aramean who was the Aramean, Lavan. There's other explanations, but basically Lavan tried to destroy us, And Yaakov, when the 70 people went down, then we were pressed in Egypt. God performed these miracles, and we became a strong and mighty nation, thanks to Hashem, and we inherited the land, which encapsulated a lot of the Jewish history. However, there's a question: why Lavan? Why is he picked as the main enemy? As we see last Parsha, um, who was picked as the main villain was Amalek. Now, why was he picked? We had later enemies that showed up in the Chumash, Balak, Bilam, there's Esav, who had been in his exile for 2,000 years and has made war on us going back to the time of Yaakov. And so why Lavan? Why is he named as the main enemy? Now, on a Parashat level, basic level, you can say, well, he tried, he wanted to not let Yaakov out. He kept cheating him on his wages. He did a lot of other things I'm going to explain in more detail. But on a higher level, we have to look that Lavan, the name Lavan means white. If you look at all the other enemies of ours, they did not have a positive name. Why is Lavan a positive name? Because we saw in the time of Yaakov tried to destroy us, I'm told, or at least keep, I mean, if Yaakov could leave, try to enslave all the uh, his wives and maidservants and children, which wouldn't have meant they wouldn't have been a Jewish people, and the whole purpose of Shem's creation wouldn't be there, wouldn't have been fulfilled. And Lavan, however, means white, it means pure. Now, we've seen all the bad things he do, so how can he be impure and pure at the same time? It's explained that Lavan, and he's also he's also the brother of Rivka and the father of Rachel and Leah and of Bilhah and Zilpah. How could somebody like that be called Lavan and white? And it shows that he's, well, on one level, that he's a trickster. He looks white, but he's anything but. He's evil. He's black. He's evil force. On the other hand, the dark side. On the other hand, is explained in the higher sources that in the higher world, Lavan is a very pure place. It represents chesed, kindness, and that is his root. And as when we get to Parshas Vayetze, and I'm explaining Lavan in more detail in the coming year, Sefer Bereshit, I go into more detail about that. But so he had that root, and it was that root, even though he got all the bad parts of Cain, excuse me, who had killed his brother Hevel. He got all the impure parts, and he was evil in potential. And as I will explain another time, he had the potential later on, and possibly at the end of the days to take to be in a different place. Now, and in Sefer Gugulim, it explains that Lavan is a Gilgul. Gilgul, his reincarnation, is that of Bilam, who tried to curse us and was one of our main enemies, even though Hashem turned his curses to blessings. And ultimately, Bilam realized Hashem wanted him praised, even said that it talked about the coming of Mashiach in one of his later prophecies. And it's listen, and Laban has the same thing as Balaam, that his power of prophecy is said to be as great as Moshe's in a sense, but he used his for evil while Moshe used his for positive. And but even with that, he had the potential to be a prophet. He misused it totally. And we see that's the same with Laban. He had that high spiritual place, but both Laban and Bilam is his Gilgal, or some say that Laban, and the Midrash says he lived from the time of Moshe, um, from the time, excuse me, of Yaakov to the time past Moshe. He lived for some 400 years when it became Bilam. In any event, whichever interpretation you want to take, there's again this potential good side. Now, what I'm going to focus on today, however, is Laban's bad side. The impact he made on the Jewish people reverberated through centuries, and it's impacting us even in some ways today. And I would like to illustrate some of those things, the havoc that Laban wreaked, even though Hashem ultimately protected Yaakov and his family, and Hashem commanded them to get out, so that Laban could not attack them when he caught up with Yaakov and his family. But I was going to show, even then, according to some sources, he still created more problems. And in another way, according to all sources, he created problems that leads then down the time of Moshe Rabbeinu and beyond. Now, what was the first major problem that Laban caused? He upset what was supposed to be the natural order. In the natural order that Hashem wanted, if Laban hadn't interfered, he would have married Rachel first. Then he would realize that, that Leah was also a good partner for him. He would have married her, and there would have been no hatred, or dislike, rivalry between Rachel and Leah in terms of the tribes. So by doing that, he created the first problem. And as is known, he converted, Rachel, supposed to be his wife. He worked 7 years for him, Yaakov. And then Laban switched Rachel with Leah. And even though Yaakov and Rachel had made up signs, she gave them to her sister, so she'd not be embarrassed, because also prophetically she saw tribes had to come from him. So what was the major problem that caused? What it did is it stopped the arrangement, as they said, that was supposed to occur in the first place. And then the first child Yaakov had, his first Koach, as it explained, he thought he was with Rachel, he was Leah. When a child is conceived in things where there's not absolute knowledge, and even though Yaakov was totally innocent, it created instability. As Yaakov says later, my son was my first Koach strength, but he was unstable like water. And that led to a major problem, because at the time of Yaakov going to Bethel, and after Rachel died, he was supposed to be with, he was supposed to be that night with Bila, because that's where Hashem's bed, not that he has a little bed, but they indicated where which wife Yaakov should be with. Ruvain moved the bed. Now, one opinion says that Ruvain actually lay with Bila, had relations with her. The other opinion says that by moving that bed, he insulted his father's honor, but it goes even way beyond that. According to when they went up to Bethel, it was supposed to be in Likutei Torah. It was supposed to be according to Likutei Torah. They were supposed to put that night he would have been Bila. If he had, he would have conceived twins, which were Ephraim and Menashe. They represented the extra quality that was needed of how a Jew functions in exile. If they had done that and they had been perfected, then there wouldn't have been a problem. And they wouldn't have either had to go down to Egypt, or if they did go down to Mitzrayim, Egypt, they would have all stayed in Goshen. There would have been no slavery, and there wouldn't have been all of the years of suffering. Now, in addition, so that was one problem they created, and that stopped those two tribes from being born, conceived, because for things to happen, they have to happen at the right time. Even one day later wouldn't have worked. Now, the other thing is, let's look at the order of the children. If Ruvain had, excuse me, not Ruvain, I'll get back to Ruvain in a minute, because there's more implications with him. If that not had happened, Raquel could have had Yosef first, because her womb could have been opened. Leah would have had children later. She wouldn't have been the unloved wife, because Yaakov would have realized, in terms of day-to-day things, with Rachel was his wife, but for the long-term history, Leah was his wife, was a perfect wife, and Yosef would have been firstborn. Reuben wouldn't have been unstable, and there's a good chance we wouldn't have had to go down to exile, because what Lavan did in doing that, it also wound up with Yosef being one of the last tribes to be born, one of the youngest sons. Only Benjamin was younger, his brother through his mother Rachel, and that led to a lot of animosity when Yosef, who was going to be the one to take us down to Egypt and provide for us in Egypt during the time of the famine, there wouldn't have been any rivalry with the brothers, because if he was the firstborn, he was the firstborn. They would have recognized him as wise. They would have regarded as the gadol dor, the chief maker of halacha, law, and the whole thing with the firstborn being displaced as the people bring the korbanot, like with the original plan, wouldn't have happened. So that is another thing, a reverberation that was caused by Lavan. Now, even more, it's in terms of the time of Lavan and Yaakov. Lavan, after they meet and they make this peace, and interestingly enough, they make the pile of stones, and Lavan says, I won't go towards your land, Yaakov, you won't go to mine. Interestingly enough, according to both the Midrash and other sources, when Bilam's fence is blocked by these stone walls, where were these stones formed that his foot got squished in? Was the same stones that Lavan had built at the time when Yaakov and he made a covenant of peace. But even then, he did not, that was not the only thing. According to Midrash Sutta, there's other ways of looking at this. it says Laban went back to his place. Now, that can even mean he went geographically back. According to the Midrash Zuta, it means he went back to his old ways of making trouble. The trickster, what did he do? He wrote a letter to Esau saying, hey, you know that good-for-nothing brother of yours? What did he do? He stole my daughters, he stole my grandchildren, he stole my sheep, etc., etc. And Esau, who was just starting to calm down after 20 years, said, okay, if that's what my good-for-nothing brother's like, I'm coming out to make war with him. That's how Esau went to confront him in the next parsha of Yeshlach, with all the problems that caused. And that also, because of that hostility, and he then wrote a second letter to Rivka saying, Esau still has his blood in his eye. You better try to convince Yaakov to pacify him. That led to us, Yaakov bowing 7 times to Esau, which means 7 times in our history, Esau, which became Edom Rome. Current to exile, we were going to bow down to him, which we wouldn't have had to otherwise. Also, because of the great fear. If you look at all the children being presented by Yaakov to Esau, they're the one missing was Dinah, because he hit her. They said if Yaakov, if Esau had married her, it might have been the last chance to redeem, which means we wouldn't have had later on the Roman exile. There wouldn't have been thousands of years of animosity. Again, this can also be put at Laban's doorstep, so to speak. It was his responsibility. Now, that was another problem. Now, even past the time of Yaakov and Lavan and going forward in history to the time when, in the 40th year in the desert, when they conquered Og and Sikon's lands, and on the the east bank of the Jordan, there was still more trouble, partially created indirectly, or not so indirectly, by Lavan, because what happened, Ruvain, and the reason they say is, well, Ruvain and God wanted the land for pastures. That's on the parsha level. But as I explained a few weeks ago, there was more going on, because what was the additional problem? The additional problem was that Ruvain's tribe, on a deeper level, as brought by the Or HaChaim, on a and the Likutei Torah and Shar Pasukim, among other sources, that they weren't allowed in because they were unstable and not worthy, because Ruvain, the originator of that tribe, was conceived improperly, even though it was no fault of Yaakov, because of the switch of Leah and Rachel. Now, that also applied to the tribe of God, because of the whole thing that Rachel did not have her own children. She at one point decided to give her maidservant Bila to Yaakov, told him about it, and he was with Bila twice. Had two tribes. Now Leah saw this; she had stopped having children, 4 children. Now remember, none of this would have happened if Rachel had married Yaakov first and Leah had married him second, and that was a problem. And Leah decided, oh, well, she wanted to have a child through her shifka, her maidservant, which was Zilpah. However, she went to Yaakov's tent that night and didn't bother telling him that it was Zilpah instead of her. That was the same kind of problem, created an unstable tribe, because he, in all innocence, but he thought he was Leah actually with Zilpah, and that exiled that tribe. Now, it also implied to the third tribe, the half-tribe Menashe. Why Menashe? I explained this earlier. I'm not going to go into all the details, but in the previous Parsha, but I will explain this much, that first of all, Leah would not have had to go to that subterfuge. They went to beat his competition. Rachel would have had children already by directly. But beyond that, because, as I said, the reversal of Yosef, that led to Yosef being resented by his brothers. They wound up sending him down to Egypt, where he became a slave. We all know that he helped the Jewish people ultimately, but look, even there, that created problems because of the trouble that Laban created by causing new animosity between Esau and Yaakov. Esau did not get to marry Dinah, and instead, what happened? She went out to see the people of Shechem. She wound up getting molested by Shechem, and there was a child produced of that union who, according to many sources, named Asnat. She eventually went down to Mitzrayim, and she became Yosef's wife, which was fine. They produced a children, but again, it looks like a very strange way to get Meshach ben Yosef going. Meshach ben Ephraim, as he's known. And again, that was caused by the same problem, because otherwise Yosef would have gone down a different way. They went into slavery, and Dinah wouldn't have, and Dinah would have had a much happier life, and Yosef would have found a wife by other means. So for all of these factors, so therefore, why is the half tribe of Manasseh not allowed? Because into the land, because Asnat had both what I would call positive spiritual genetics from Yosef, but there was also from Shechem. Dinah was positive, but Shechem wasn't. They were negative forces, negative genetics. And for the half tribe of Manasseh, they inherited the negative genetics of their mother Asnat from Shechem and other negative aspects, and therefore that half tribe wasn't allowed any other. I inherited the positive side of Dinah, and by extension Yosef, and they were allowed to go in. So, losing those 2.5 tribes also had implications which are beyond the scope of the Torah, but it also created more problems. So the whole history of the Jewish people would have been very different if, but for the fact of all the things that Laban set off. However, Shem, despite all that, still protected our ancestor Yaakov, and we are still, even though it's taking thousands of years, we are ultimately heading soon to the ultimate redemption. Good Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.